the offended person, the damaged person, in perpetual, it doesn't limit them to forgiveness. And so I actually am not sure about it needing that. Perhaps a society can offer that full, frank truth-telling on behalf of the perpetrator, even when they don't. That's maybe what the judgment helps stand in place, in order for the victim to be able to say, this was wrong, and I can do something about that now, which is what we may call forgiveness.
Yeah, it's really interesting. I've heard forgiveness in those circumstances described as, the victim or the survivor shouldn't be asked to or shouldn't have to carry around this perpetrator in their life as a piece of baggage, and that forgiveness is like just dropping the bag, dropping the baggage, letting go of it. I guess the jury's still out in my mind as to whether or not that is forgiveness or whether it's a form of letting go. And yeah, we could have that discussion. There's a I think the argument lies in that place of whether or not forgiveness involves some form of reparatory or restorative justice, and whether just being able to let go of the perpetrator is psychotherapy. That would be the nub of the argument for that. So, but I mean, yeah, we'll design a unit on it. We'll teach a whole unit. People write PhDs and books on the nature of forgiveness and restorative justice. It is a core concern of the Christian faith, Christian narrative. Yeah. I think one of the things we're picking up here is that human beings are irreducible. There are all kinds of ways of understanding ourselves. We are, in a sense, mystery. We can't be reduced to this or that understanding of what it means to be human. Descartes tried to reduce us to our reflective, rational capacity. He was a bit concerned that he couldn't trust any form of sensory experience or perception, so he reduced the human person to the capacity to rationally deduct, basically maths. The spiritual care, pastoral care movement has been largely, as has much thought since Descartes' time, a reaction against that reductionism. We can't be reduced. Just as we can't, those of us who are of religious faith realise that we cannot reduce God to a doctrinal statement or a biblical text or a particular human experience or a particular church's understanding of who or what God is. We can't reduce God to that because we understand every time we try and box God into this little neat package, we experience God in a different way that's outside that package. That's the nature of what we call God. And human beings, as Beth said, have been made in the image of God according to the Christian and Hebrew traditions. Our very nature is that of the irreducible. We can't be reduced, which is another reason why spiritual carers create space for the other to be. Because if I try and reduce them to my agenda for their life, I take their dignity, their humanity away from them. So we move through that high rationalist part of which is really part of the Protestant tradition, and we see Protestant thought based on Reformation thinking and so on, shifting back towards the human person as irreducible. Baruch Spinoza was another rationalist, but a rationalist very, very much based, his thinking based on the Hellenistic philosophers, if you want to live a flourishing, ethical life, you understand yourself. And the way we understand ourselves is through rational deduction. So his methods, perhaps we would disagree with, they're a bit reductionist, but his ideals were perhaps more in line with what we're trying to achieve. Live a reflective life. Understand yourself. Don't ignore yourself. Understand where you're coming from. So rationalism sort of hit its peak around about this time with Descartes and Spinoza and Leibniz and other high rationalists. But that kind of reductionism of the human person was quickly critiqued. Can you think of other ways that we reduce human beings, our understanding of what it means to be human? How do you do it in your life? And don't say, I don't do it, because I won't believe you. What forms of reductionism do we fall into? Do you know what I mean?
By labelling people?
Sorry?
By labelling
By
them
labelling
like a
people?
profession or something
Yeah.
like that.
What sort of labels do we put on people?
So like a counselor. I'm like a counselor. I'm like a doctor.
Okay,
That kind
yeah,
of thing. That's
Yeah. So
really
that's who you are.
That's it.
There it is.
Yeah.
That's the doctor box.
Yeah.
You can't say anything about you other than that. Okay.
Intellectually labelling.
Yeah. Say a bit more about that one.
Some people, like even with visiting my mother-in-law yesterday, she tends to, everyone, if you're an intellectual, you're sort of up there and you've got everything in life. If you're intellectual, then you can be the most horrible person, but you're an intellectual.
Yeah.
So that's really good. So in some people's horizon, intellectualism is like everything.
So we can reduce people to virtues. And one of the virtues that we value
Yeah.
is, what would you say, education? What would you say? Is that education or
Ability
knowledge?
to be highly educated.
What are some of the other values that we reduce ourselves to? That's a really good point.
Physical
So-
appearance,
Physical appearance,
sporting ability, I suppose.
ability, sexuality,
What is your identity?
yeah,
Because every time you try and say your identity, unless you just keep talking and talking and talking, you probably reduce yourself.
yeah, okay, so as soon as you try and nail it down.
That's kind of like you can expand on that, but
Yeah.
so as soon as you ask someone their identity,
Yeah,
you're automatically asking them to
Yeah.
introduce yourself. What are you?
yeah, absolutely. So political name calling is one thing. You're a greenie. You know. Now, if someone says to me, "You're a greenie," I'm immediately aware of ways in which I can be identified beyond that designation. You know, so I resist reduction. But some of you will quite happily just wipe me off because I have an environmental concern as a greenie. Yeah. It's one of the laziest forms of mental activity known to humankind, is this reductionist naming. Spiritual care resists reduction in these ways. It opens space when it's present to the other person. It does not assume that my assumptions about the other are correct. So I might come in and I'm sitting down with a person who is a 50-year-old white male, educated at university, and I might sit down and my assumptions will be, oh, this person's the same as I am. Am I right? How can I possibly know? And I will never know if I don't pay attention. So I become aware of my own assumptions and I deal with them appropriately in that context. Now, sometimes it's appropriate to actually name your own awareness of your assumptions, so that you bring that actually into space. That's got to be pretty careful about that stuff. One of the things, one of the hot topics of conversation in our society at the moment is the question of gender and sexuality. One of the big hot topics in the church at the moment is same-sex relationships. I'll just put it out there right now, pretty close to the beginning of the semester, because it's probably going to come up. We as a Christian community, in all of our diversity, have reduced ourselves to anxiety about this single question in a way that I just cannot understand. In a sense I can't understand it. In another sense I can. Because human sexuality is integral to humanness. And so of course it concerns us deeply. But to reduce it to this question of gay or not gay is not of the gospel, I would have said. And we can access this particular question. I briefly mentioned intersex birth, which gender and sexuality are slightly different issues. Would you have said that? Would you agree with that? Sex is related to gender, but we relate it to gender. So let's just say a child is born with an intersex physiology, which means they have elements of their physiology that would be termed to be classically female and elements that would be termed to be classically male, and they display internal or external signs of both genders. Traditionally, medically and socially, at birth, we have designated a gender to children who are born with these particular forms of physiology. Okay, so we use surgery, so physical reassignment, gender assignment, one way or the other, and we use gender. So that's sex assignment, sexuality, and gender assignment. So in our actual minds, we assign them a particular gender, male or female. There's only two options. What's going on there for us when we look at that? Someone's born in a particular way, and we make certain decisions around what to do in response to that. What's happening? What are we applying?
Control?
Control, okay. So who's got control? Who's got control in this situation?
The decision maker.
Okay, so everyone other than the child.
Yeah.
Okay, so control belongs to medicine, parents, although parents are often disempowered by the medical network. Who else is in control?
You have to put something on the form, on the birth form.
Yep.
Legislators.
Right, so legislators.
Make you tick a box.
Yep, absolutely. Who else is in control? Schools, okay. Which kind of relates to social, community expectations, probably the general goodwill towards the child to want that child to fit in, maybe, in their community, not to stand out. But what does that say about us as a community?
That people need to fit in. We only want what is like us.
Right. We only want people like us. And we're a binary gendered society. These people who have been born perfectly healthily, they function perfectly well, as they are reassigned by us based on the fact that we are not paying attention to them. We're not creating space for this beautiful, irreducible, living organism to be itself. Yeah? We apply all these other external expectations that are culturally and socially and religiously constructed in order to make this child like us. That's a form of reductionism. And good spiritual care will resist it every step of the way in the creation of space. Kenotic humility, self-emptying humility. We empty ourselves of all of this in order to create a space whereby the individual human being might flourish in themselves. Now that's pretty challenging because religious language, religions are actually designed to make us all the same. Yeah? To conform to a particular pattern, to conform to a particular person. It's no longer I who live, but Christ who lives in me. It's a very strong narrative. So one of our questions as we learn, go on and learn and critically assess what it means to be a spiritual carer in this sense of kenotic humility is how do those ideas intersect? And what do we do with them? What does it actually mean to say it's no longer I who live, but Christ who lives in me? I'm not going to answer it for you. I'm just going to throw in a question. So, one of the people in Christian Protestant history who enabled this turn away from reductionism towards the complexity of the subject, the human individual, was a guy with a fantastic name called Friedrich Schleiermacher, who I hope you all read in his fullness. Well, you know, he was a 19th century thinker, he was believed in systems and so on, but in his defence, he understood, he recognised that the human person is irreducible and that faith is actually a living human experience, not a doctrinal statement. He's accredited for being the first academic in the modern era to make practical theology actually a part of the university offering. So they created a chair of practical theology, which was all to do with studying and researching and theologising about the human subject. What does it mean to be a human being who experiences faith and relationship with the world and God? It doesn't sound particularly spectacular to us these days. We're used to doing it, but in those days it was a radical move, and many in the Christian church spent the next 100 years trying to eradicate his thought, but it's starting to come back, particularly in our field, in its strength. He called faith the feeling of absolute dependence.
Chris, can I ask why they spent so much effort trying to get rid of it? Why did they react adversely?
Well, it was partly contextual questions, and it was related to the fact that Schleiermacher represented the height of humanist optimism. You know, to actually study the human subject was allowable because their understanding of what it means to be human was very high. You know, sin was not discussed. There was more of a psychological understanding, pretty close to what we have today, actually, about the human condition. You deal with things psychologically, not as a moral issue, and you have high confidence in the human person to be a flourishing, just, good, intelligent being. Yeah? But of course, what happened in the 20th century? 2 world wars, the disastrous results of colonialism started to become apparent, and confidence in the human condition collapsed. So Schleiermacher was accused by Karl Barth, who was one of the great Swiss-German theologians of the 20th century, of reducing faith to psychology, and that was meant as an insult. And Barth said, you know, we can of ourselves know nothing of God. We rely entirely on God's self-revelation to us. So faith is not a feeling of absolute dependence. It's a kind of abject delivering over of oneself to the mercy of a God whose decision-making is opaque. And that's a bit of a characteriser, you know, like a bit of a caricature of Barth. He wrote 6 million words. He's a little bit more complex than that. Go and read him. But it was a contextual issue that caused the controversy, really. Schleiermacher was interested in reunifying faith with science, with the modern worldview. Most theologians would say he failed, but my favourite theologian, Paul Tillich, said his project is the project of modern theology, and we cannot forget it. Just because Schleiermacher didn't quite use the right language doesn't mean we should ignore it. The human experience of life and God and the world is actually what it's about. What was I going to do? Oh, that's right. This comes very much into our understanding of spirituality, and we'll talk about this more later in the course as well. Schleiermacher was talking about the interaction between our experience of ourselves as dependent and free. What do you think he meant? I'm going to have to rush in because we're running out of time as usual. How are you dependent?
I'm dependent on my environment, oxygen, my family, on my body to food, water, everything.
Yeah, and that's connected with this as well. Absolutely. Yep. So you're dependent. How are you free?
I can choose
Choice.
certain things. I'm free.
You can change your environment, can't you? You can do things to change your environment. You can create. Yeah, that's related to choice. Yeah. Schleiermacher was saying, yep, we're free and we're dependent, but underlying all of this, we are ultimately dependent on something irreducible beyond ourselves. He's talking about God. Yeah. So our freedom is limited freedom. Our dependence, in that sense, is ultimate. And this is nowhere more obvious than the fact, firstly, I was born, and I had no say in that, and I will die, and I cannot change that. So my freedom is limited freedom. And he called faith this kind of awestruck awareness of my dependence on that which is other. Rudolf Otto, another German theologian, called it, and you'll hear this often, even amongst atheists. Christopher Hitchens, the late famous atheist, used this word of his own sense of the world. Rudolf Otto called this sense of ultimate dependence a sense of the numinous, which literally just means the spiritual power of a thing. It's a kind of a pre-conscious, physiological, organic sense of oneself as a living creature. So you can see the radical turn back to the human subject as an irreducible mystery that took place. And Schleiermacher is therefore rightly often said, in the Protestant tradition at least, to be the person who enabled us to begin to think deeply about pastoral and spiritual care in a way that hadn't been able to up to then. This guy, Albert Schweitzer, sorry, there's a lot of white male Germans who are dead. That's partly a cultural thing. We'll get to a white female French person shortly, as we always do. This guy was amazing. He was a theologian and a European-wide renowned pipe organist who decided that his theology was too rarefied and German. The rubber needed to hit the road, so he went off and trained as a medical doctor, as you do, and moved to Africa, where he built a hospital and worked with people who suffered from sleeping sickness, which I don't actually know what the technical medical designation is for that disease nowadays, but it was a disease rife in the area where he was, and he developed an understanding of the human life and spirituality that took into account our physiology, basically. He recognised within the physiological processes of homeostatic regulation, the inbuilt process of change in order to stay alive that we have inbuilt in our bodies, he recognised that as spirit. And he called it the implicit I will to live. And it's pre-conscious and it's conscious. We don't decide to start shivering when it's cold. Our bodies just do that.
So the mechanism of homeostasis, you're saying, is connected with
Spirit. Yeah, that's right. Yeah. Yeah. So spirit in this sense is physiological. And it develops in its conscious form as an overall reverence for life. Because I will to live is not only I will to live, just me, because implicit in that is the understanding that we are dependent. We can actually only live when we are in relationship with others and in our environment. So I will to live, in his thought, became I will to live amongst other wills to live. And one cannot be without the other. And that develops into a conscious reverence for life. We call these things the first spiritual acts. And they happen in us every second, every microsecond of every second as part of our physiological living. So you can see we've gone from reducing the human being to a rational thing to this amazing, irreducible, physiological act of life, of ruach, of spirit. And the French philosopher Simone Weil, sorry Beth, I know you get to hear about Simone Weil all the time. One of the smartest existentialist philosophers of the mid-20th century, graded higher than Simone de Beauvoir in her philosophy exam, and yet went in very, very different directions. She was a communist. She believed that communist revolution was the answer to Europe's problem after the First World War. But she also believed that you can't just theorise about people. If you want to write good philosophy, you need to create proximity. You need to pay attention. And so she left her job as a teacher and she went and worked for a year in the Renault factory so she could understand whether or not the proletariat, the working poor, were in fact thinking about communist revolution as the answer to their problems. And what she came away was with a paper that she wrote saying the proletariat are too busy just trying to survive. No one is talking about communist revolution. And she changed her philosophy. But she also, as a pacifist, enlisted with the in the ranks of the anarchists in the Spanish Civil War, who were revolting against the Spanish. What's it called? Dictator. And she went and fought. Yeah, she went and fought in the Spanish Civil War as someone against her own convictions, because she believed in creating proximity in order to understand what is actually happening. And I always invoke her as one of the saints of spiritual care, precisely for this reason, that she called us to pay attention to the actual living reality. And when we're offering care to another person, if we are distracted by ideals, ideas, assumptions, agendas, religions, philosophies, whatever, that we're trying to apply to the person in front of us, we're not paying attention. And Simone Weil called us to pay attention. If we get time later on in the semester, we might watch a bit of a movie about Simone Weil. Paul Tillich, who I keep quoting, said this: Faith as ultimate concern is an act of the total personality. It happens in the centre of the personal life and includes all its elements. Faith is the most centred act of the human mind. It is not a movement of a special section or a special function of humanity's total being. They are all united in the act of faith. But as faith is not the sum total of their impacts, it transcends every special impact as well as the totality of them, and it has itself a decisive impact on each of them. He called faith ultimate concern because he differentiated it from belief. Belief has very specific doctrinal content, and it's quite a rational thing. Concern is an existential orientation of one's entire life towards that which is ultimate, that which is irreducible. And in this sense, he believed faith was an intrinsically human condition, whether you are religious or not. And he goes on in a book about love and justice. In order to know what is just in a person-to-person encounter, love listens. It is its first task to listen. No human relation, especially no intimate one, is possible without mutual listening. All things and all human persons, so to speak, call on us with small or loud voices. They want us to listen. They want us to understand their intrinsic claims, their justice of being. They want justice from us, but we can give it to them only through the love which listens. And that's the essence of spiritual care. Naming, recognising, validating the implicit justice of the other being through listening. And just as we get ready to go home, we'll go on to our next unit. This guy, Carl Rogers, popped up in the secular psychology world with a thing called unconditional positive regard. Is anyone aware of this? It's a way of being with other people whom you are listening to. It was working against the cold, clinical, rational, professional persona of the expert. I'm the expert, you're the patient, you listen to me, do what I tell you to do and you'll get well. And it was an embrace, really, of what Paul Tillich was talking about. Recognising the intrinsic humanness of the other person and offering it dignity and genuine presence. And so he said things like this, let's whip through them. I've found that the more I can be genuine in the relationship, the more helpful it will be. It is only in this way that the relationship can have reality, and reality seems deeply important as a first condition. So not fantasy, not ideology, not utopia, reality. Remember we were talking about ideology before? Commitment to ideas when the truth is inconvenient. Yeah. It is only by providing the genuine reality which is in me that the other person can successfully seek for reality in themselves. You see, starting to build a mutual sense of human dignity in the encounter. I find that the more acceptance and liking I feel towards this individual, the more I will be creating a relationship which they can use. That's tough. I find that hard, you know. Like, I should like everyone that I'm caring for. Don't you either like people or not? You know? Who's saying, well, you can actually, through a depth of reflection and reflective practice, you can build a genuine capacity to like other human beings because they are human. By acceptance, I mean a warm regard for them as a person of unconditional self-worth, of value no matter what their condition, their behaviour or their feelings. It means a respect and liking for them as a separate person, a willingness for them to possess their own feelings in their own way. It means an acceptance of and regard for their attitudes of the moment, no matter how negative or positive, no matter how much they may contradict other attitudes they have held in the past. Can you feel a validation that's kind of...
I can feel his attitude.
Yeah, right. And he's saying attitude is everything in the relationship. How you are present in the space is everything. Now, he's a therapist, and his thought has shaped counselling theory in the last 50 years.
What's his name again, please, sorry?
Carl Rogers. However, I reckon he's actually pretty close to a spiritual care practitioner as well. I say to my counselling students, Carl Rogers is where spiritual care and counselling meet. The individual will discover within themselves the capacity to use this relationship for growth. Back to Schleiermacher. The human person has faith. It's implicit in them. They have an ultimate concern for that which is ultimate. Whether one calls it a growth tendency, a drive towards self-actualization, or a forward-moving directional tendency, all sounds very dry to me. I prefer the will to live, with Schweitzer. It is the mainspring of life and is, in the last analysis, the tendency upon which all psychotherapy depends. It is the urge which is evident in all organic and human life to expand, extend, become autonomous, develop, mature. The tendency to express and activate all the capacities of the organism to the extent that such activation enhances the organism or the self, homeostatic regulation. The inbuilt will to live. I was going to say something very, very briefly, which has almost escaped me, and it has escaped me. So we'll finish there. We could have gone on. We've got a bunch of other quotes and things there. I'll put all those things up on ARC for you to go through and have a look at. Thank you for the conversation today. Thank you for being here while we watched a momentous historical event, part of it anyway. And I hope that what we've reflected on will land in some concrete places for you. I think Mary's on next week. Is that right? Or am I on again next week? No, I'm on next week and then Mary the week after. So